Okay, so today we will be going through the ninth essay of the phenomenon of life, Gnosticism, existentialism, and nihilism. So, Gnosticism and existentialism, these two movements are obviously separated quite widely in both time and space. But nevertheless, Jonas is doing here a very interesting sort of hermeneutic technique of reciprocal illumination between the two. Jonas also he wrote a book on Gnosticism, I think before the phenomenon of life, maybe quite some time before. I don't remember, don't know exactly how long. And the novelty in his approach is rather than simply trying to introduce an existentialist reading of Gnosticism, which is not maybe too controversial in the sense that it is kind of well, it makes sense. It's a hermeneutic that offers itself in a way. What he is also trying to do is complement it with the other direction. As he puts it, the hermeneutic functions become reversed and reciprocal. Lock turns into key and key into lock. The existentialist reading of Gnosticism, so well vindicated by its hermeneutic success, invites as its natural complement the trial of a Gnostic reading of existentialism. And soon enough, we'll get into what both Gnosticism and existentialism are in this context. In any case, when it comes to existentialism and the sort of contemporary situation, the beginnings of that Jonas locates in the 17th century already. He cites, for example, Pascal in his statement, cast into the infinite immensity of spaces of which I am ignorant and which know me not, I am frightened. So we have this sentiment of an infinite immensity, an indifferent infinity that cares not for man. A sentiment that, of course, will play a very major part in existentialism. Now, in Pascal's universe and in the general sort of Weltanschauung of the of Cartesian philosophy, very broadly understood, man does have some kind of a superiority over other things, as precisely being res cogitans, as being a thinking thing. But this superiority is of a very particular kind. It's not a higher integration into the totality of being. It's not that man is placed higher up on a kind of well-ordered um, ladder of being, but rather this superiority is an unbridgeable gulf between man and the rest of existence. So that the man's superiority, the fact that he is a thinking thing, precisely cuts him off from everything else. And this also ties into the role of the cosmos, which he talked about previously, Jonas talked about previously in the book, and which we'll get into here as well very soon. In any case, what happens is that in that kind of a universe, meaning is no longer found, but it is conferred by man. And this is how we get into the Nietzschean phase of existentialism. Here he quotes a quatrain from Nietzsche's poem, Vereinsamt. And it's a very, very, very beautiful little quatrain that so beautifully sums up the core sentiment of nihilism. So I think it's worth quoting in the original and the translation. So the original, die Welt ein Tor zu tausend Wüsten stumm und kalt, wer das verlor, was du verlorst, macht nirgends Halt. And the translation, which is interestingly enough from a friend of Jonas's that wished to remain anonymous, even though I assume, or rather I would assume that at that time, you know, the Vereinsamt would have been translated already, probably multiple times. But in any case, the translation that Jonas cites, the world's a gate to deserts stretching mute and chill, who once has lost what thou hast lost, stands nowhere still. That is the existentialist backdrop, essentially. And here is worth noting that even though prior to the Nietzschean phase, and let alone later on the Sartrean and Heideggerian phase, even in Pascal's vision of the world is created by God. That still stands, but the God in question is an unknown God. The only attribute of God that is revealed through creation is his power. So there is no kind of cosmic reason giving order to everything, but just pure power. Another quote here: the Deus absconditus, of whom nothing but will and power can be predicated, leaves behind as his legacy, upon departing the scene, the Homo absconditus, a concept of man characterized solely by will and power, the will for power, the will to will. For such a will, even indifferent nature is more an occasion for its exercise than a true object. So, again, no cosmic order, simply power as the only kind of firstly the only revealed attribute of God, and later on the only thing that is left for man once God departs the scene. Here, Jonas pinpoints as the essence of existentialism something that he calls an anthropological acosmism. So this is the sort of separation, the rift between man and the cosmos. It's important to note that this isn't necessarily tied to modern science, because normally, or most often in any case, the whole story of the nihilism and how the whole crisis of meaning appeared tends to tie the whole thing up with the development of materialist science. But according to Jonas, this is not the key issue. It is, of course, related, but the point is this acosmism, and this acosmism isn't essentially scientific. So it can develop, and indeed it had previously developed without modern science. And the parallel is obviously the Gnostic movement, which he understands as, well, maybe it's worth saying that the term Gnosticism itself is extremely controversial in the history of religion. But at any rate, what is meant here is a movement, or rather a set of movements in the first 3 centuries AD. We'll now get to what this movement is all about. Essentially, in a nutshell, the core thesis of Gnosticism is that there is an absolute rift between man and world. So man, or rather the pneuma, the spirit, is in a way, along with God, opposed to the world. So on the one hand, we have man and God, and on the other hand, we have the world. But even though man, in a way, shares something with God, has something of the divine in him, he is nevertheless separated by God precisely by being immersed in the world. And here's a nice quote that sums up the main aspects of this teaching. In its theological aspect, this doctrine states that the divine is alien to the world and has neither part nor concern in the physical universe. That the true God, strictly transmundane, is not revealed or even indicated by the world, and is therefore the unknown, the totally other, unknowable in terms of any worldly analogies. Correspondingly, in its cosmological aspect, it states that the world is the creation not of God, but of some inferior principle, that being, of course, the demiurge, whose law it executes. And in its anthropological aspect, that man's inner self, the pneuma, spirit, in contrast to soul or psyche, is not part of the world, of nature's creation and domain, but is within that world as totally transcendent and as unknown by all worldly categories as is its transmundane counterpart, the unknown God without. So here we have this absolute, unbridgeable gulf stated very, given the breadth of content covered here, fairly succinctly, I would say. Okay, so in this worldview, man can attain to some kind of salvific knowledge, but he can only do so in opposition to the world, by resisting the world, the universe being a manifestation of nothing but ignorance and power, essentially. that which holds man back from knowledge. And here it's important to note that the universe is, in a way, still a cosmos. It is an order, but as Jonas beautifully puts it, it is an order with a vengeance, alien to man's aspirations. So it's not that we have a disordered, completely indifferent cosmos. We have order, but this order is no longer some kind of a benevolent, well-ordered thing, but rather something oppressive, something brutal, something demonic in a way, by being demiurgical. So here we have the Stoic logos, the Stoic notion of fate, essentially, replaced by heimatmene, which is a different, also a word that means fate, but here it's used more often in this kind of a, with connotations of something oppressive, of something that is not a kind of benevolent, well-ordered whole. So, long story short, the world is a system of power to be overcome by power. Power, in this case, being the power of the savior and of salvific knowledge. And here we can see the similarity with modern nihilism. In both cases, we have a world which is a manifestation of power and that can only be dealt with through power. So how did this situation come about in the case of Gnosticism? Here it's important to compare the Gnostic situation to what preceded it. So in the classical ontology of antiquity, there was an interesting notion and omnipresent notion of the whole being prior to its parts, a specific kind of chain of being, to put it that way. And that ontology was based on, or rather, well, based on, related to, in any case, the polis, so the social organization of life in Greek antiquity. But later on, when the Greek city-states gave way to the Roman Empire, things obviously changed here. So we no longer, there was no longer a polis as a kind of fairly self-sufficient and tight-knit community. Rather, we have something that's much more overarching and all-encompassing. And this is where Stoic pantheism comes onto the scene. So the relationship between the citizen and the city, which was the paradigmatic relationship in antiquity, in classical antiquity, is replaced by the relationship between the individual and the cosmos. And instead of having a function, as each citizen had in the city, all that an individual has is a role. This is a very interesting difference that Jonas really, I think, fleshes out very beautifully. The point here is that in the polis, every citizen could have a function that was in a way important for the whole itself. Whereas in the Roman Empire and in Stoic ethics, this is replaced by a simple role. So instead of a function, which is essential, one needs to play one's role with a certain kind of bravado and accept it heroically. But being a role, it is not exactly that essential for the whole itself. It is in a way fictitious. So given this kind of change, because of course here we have to keep in mind that even according to the Stoics, of course we don't have a kind of tight-knit community in the city and whatnot, but nevertheless this overarching logos is still benevolent. But once it has been transformed into something so overarching and all-encompassing, it doesn't take much for Gnosticism to make the next transformation, namely to understand this law as an external and inaccessible and indeed oppressive force. So a consequence of Gnostic acosmism is its antinomianism, the lack of a kind of nomos ordering the world. Here, Jonas puts the matter beautifully when he says that if Nietzsche talks about the death of God, then what the Gnostics are pointing out is that of the God of the cosmos, of the ordering principle. Here's a lovely description of the Gnostic God. I quote, the Gnostic God has more of the nihil than the ens in his concept. A transcendence withdrawn from any normative relation to the world is equal to a transcendence which has lost its effective force. In other words, for all purposes of man's relation to the reality that surrounds him, this hidden God is a nihilistic conception. No nomos emanates from him, no law for nature, and thus none for human action as a part of the natural order. So, the orderliness of the cosmos is gone. And this has one very interesting consequence, namely that moral law, which is in a way a complement to physical and political law, which of course made it, which of course was a positive thing in classical antiquity for it to be a complement of the physical and the political. Moral law is still a complement of the physical law, but in the Gnostic understanding of physical law, that means that moral law is demiurgical. It issues from the demiurge. It is, in a way, evil, as strange as that might sound. And this gives us a kind of a positive argument against morality for the through and through Gnostic. And by opposing, by trying to extricate this oneself from these demiurgical laws, what one can achieve is a freedom, a kind of freedom, but a freedom not of the soul, the psyche, but rather of the spirit, the pneuma. And this is, Jonas links this up again in a very interesting way with Heidegger's analysis, Heidegger's account of man, or rather Heidegger's argument against the notion that man is a rational animal. So, just as the Gnostics deny any kind of salvific, soteriological significance to the soul, which is of this world, and assign it only to the spirit, which is not of this world at all, so Heidegger denies any kind of attempt to understand man through categories that can be assigned to things in the world. And this is in the fairly early on in being in time. I don't remember exactly where, but it's very, very, very near the beginning, where Heidegger makes a famous argument against the notion of man being a rational animal. And here Jonas has another sort of criticism of Heidegger, namely that Heidegger misunderstands what rational animal, what the term originally meant. So the original term for animal was zoon, rational animal being zoon logon echon, the being that has logos, reason, rational animal. But in the original Greek, zoon, that does not exactly mean brute or beast, all of these things that kind of tend to be associated with the word animal. Rather, it simply means being. It comes from the like the word zoe, life. It just means something that lives, something that is a living being. So there is no denigration in the term zoon, and this is one of quite a few actually instances where Jonas criticizes Heidegger's philological abilities, which is a criticism that may be at least somewhat justified. Okay, so what is the content of gnosis? What is the thing that sort of sets one free from all of this? Here, Jonas quotes a lovely Valentinian statement of this. What makes us free is the knowledge of who we were, what we have become, where we were, wherein we have been thrown, whereto we speed, wherefrom we are redeemed, what is birth and what rebirth. Very very ambitious statement. In any case, here what we can notice is that we have a set of antithetical pairs. So we have a kind of very pronounced dualist spin to all of this. So we have where we were, from wherefrom we are redeemed, etc. A very kind of interesting eschatological tension. And we also have throneless here, wherein we have been thrown, which will, of course, echo again through Pascal and Heidegger. Another interesting feature of this is that this statement refers essentially only to the past and the future. Or rather, the Gnostic concept of gnosis refers to this. The present is, in the Gnostic conception, only present. It is only understood as the moment of gnosis itself. It doesn't have kind of a authentic existence of its own, and we'll soon see why this is important. But before we get to why this is important, it's here also worth noting that unlike in existentialism, in Gnosticism, it nevertheless is the case that man has his origin and his aim in eternity. So this is, of course, something that does not really stay the same in the parallel of existentialism, especially not of Heidegger's brand of existentialism. Okay, so what's the deal with the present in Heidegger's view? Here, Jonas says that he tried to make a kind of table of different existentials, so what Heidegger uses in place of categories for Dasein, and to organize them according to their temporal horizon, whether they're past, present, or future. And Jonas says that he was surprised to find that there was pretty much nothing that could go in the present box. Here's a bit longer quote on this. Actually, a great deal is said about the existential present, but not as an independent dimension in its own right. For the existentially genuine present is the present of the situation, which is wholly defined in terms of the self's relation to its future and past. It flashes up, as it were, in the light of decision, when the projected future reacts upon the given past. So this is the Geworfenheit, thrownness. And in this meeting constitutes what Heidegger calls the moment, the Augenblick. Moment, not duration, is the temporal mode of this present, a creature of the other two horizons of time, a function of their ceaseless dynamics, and no independent dimension to dwell in. Detached, however, from this context of inner movement, by itself, mere present denotes precisely the renouncement of genuine future-past relation in the abandonment or surrender to talk, curiosity, and the anonymity of every man, das Mann. And these are all modes of Verfallenheit, fallenness. A failure of the tension of true existence, a kind of slackness of being. Indeed, Verfallenheit, a negative term, which also includes the meaning of degeneration and decline, is the existential proper to present as such, showing it to be a derivative and deficient mode of existence. This might be a tad confusing to those not that well versed in Heidegger, but essentially the present is inauthentic. That's the gist of this here. And it is this kind of a ceaseless dynamism, a constant change, no real present being present, that was so appropriate for the times, so appropriate for the zeitgeist in the German 20s and 30s, in that time of crisis that led to a fascinating number of experiments, some more, some less successful, all sorts of things happening. And of course, Jonas does hint at the relationship between Heidegger's views and one such particular experiment in Germany. Not the only time that Jonas does that. That is kind of another recurrent theme throughout the book. So apart from this ceaseless dynamism, this kind of a degradation of the present, Another thing that's very important in Heidegger's view is the way that nature itself is degraded. So Heidegger talks about essentially two crucial modes of being, of the being of beings. He talks about Zuhandenheit and Vorhandenheit. So being that is Zuhanden is being ready to hand, I think is the typical English translation. It is being that it offers itself to be used. It is something that we use that is in a way transparent and that allows us to enact our care, our Sorge, our care in the world, our projects in the world. I know I'm throwing around a whole bunch of anachronistic terminology here, but do forgive me for that. So that's Zuhanden. Vorhanden, and the English translation is, I think it's typically just present. What is present? I don't know if there's a different translation, but I don't think there's one that's kind of that captures the relationship between Zuhanden and Vorhanden in German. So this, what is Vorhanden is something that is merely there, that is just there, that is in a way contemplated in a detached manner, but it is a secondary mode of being, and this is crucial for Heidegger. So, given that nature is degraded to just being there, to this Vorhandenheit, this is essentially the objective complement of Verfallenheit. So, both the present and nature are degraded to what are essentially inauthentic modes of existence. And of course, the parallels with Gnosticism should be obvious here. Now, to sum up and briefly present some of Jonas's concluding thoughts here, there's an interesting difference between the Gnostic and the modern conception. So, Gnostic man is thrown into an anti-human nature. The cosmos is actively opposed to man's soteric quest. It is actively attempting to keep man ignorant, to prevent man from attaining salvation. In modernity, we have a decidedly different picture. So man is also thrown, in a way, but into an indifferent nature. So nature does not really care whether man attains anything. Nature is not some kind of demiurgical demonic creation. It is just there. It is indifferent. It could not care less for man. And the interesting thing here is that this latter conception is indicative of an infinitely more radical nihilism. Because if man is thrown into an inhuman nature, at least he has something to fight against. He has some kind of a resistance to try to overcome. He has a heroic quest that is his by nature, in a way, that is his by birth, that is his birthright, that he can try at least to fulfill. But if nature is indifferent, there is nothing to do then. There is no kind of resistance. There's nothing that man can do about it. This again offers a lovely parallel with Nietzsche. I think in the there are at least a couple fragments of the collection that was later published as The Will to Power, where Nietzsche talks about this. It's not in any case, it's not suffering that's the problem, it's the why of suffering. There not being the why, that's the problem here. But this modern conception, even though it offers a kind of infinitely more radical nihilism, also isn't that consistent, unlike the Gnostic conception, because it seems to take the notion of thrownness, the notion of man being thrown into nature, but it does away with the thrower. So it surreptitiously takes the throw and dispenses with the thrower, which is not a very consistent move to make. And here Jonas has a very nice kind of optimistic note. I know that appeared in several of the past essays, where he says that if we take, and this isn't the quote yet, if we take the notion of value, of man being some kind of valuing being, of any kind of value in life, if we take that seriously, then we can't just understand life as being thrown into an indifferent nature if there is no thrower. Instead, our understanding of value has to reshape our understanding of the whole of the universe, so as to be able to accommodate that value. And yeah, it should sound familiar given several of the previous essays. So to end on another surprisingly positive, optimistic note for what is a less than completely optimistic essay, and a very lovely quote here. The disruption between man and total reality is at the bottom of nihilism. The illogicality of the rupture, that is, of a dualism without metaphysics, makes its fact no less real, nor its seeming alternative any more acceptable. The stare at isolated selfhood, to which it condemns man, may wish to exchange itself for a monistic naturalism which, along with the rupture, would abolish also the idea of man as man. Between that Scylla and this her twin Charybdis, the modern mind hovers. Whether a third road is open to it, one by which the dualistic rift can be avoided, and yet enough of the dualistic insight saved to uphold the humanity of man, philosophy must find out. That's it for the presentation. So let's get into the discussion. And yeah, of course, since I am also hosting this thing, so who would like to open the floor with questions or any thoughts or anything? And by the way, one thing that I myself would like to add later on, if anyone is interested in Nietzsche's nihilism and one often completely neglected formative influence on Nietzsche, namely the essentially forgotten poet Ernst Ortleb. I can say a few words about that and share a paper about that if anyone is interested.
Maybe one question I would like to open with, not directly related to the philosophy itself, but the historical context. Is there anyone here who knows more about the context in which Gnosticism arose? Because he doesn't go very deeply into that. He mentions briefly that it was from this background of Roman cities that were then taken up into the empire and that changed the context. But I'm curious, like, what was the broader cultural, religious, historical context where this early form of nihilism arose?
I think we have someone who managed to do an MA in history on the side, so I'll.
Yeah, but still, I mean, the only thing I know about this is, the Gnostic movement in general was extremely heterogeneous. It wasn't something that was that sometimes it's even a bit of a misnomer to call it like that. I mean, historians might have certain issues and whatnot because you had very different groups who were defending very different views. There were certain similarities or certain tendencies towards which they gravitated, which is precisely this extremely dualistic conception and understanding that Jonas hones in on. The situations as such, I'm not sure whether you are trying to kind of see whether the development of this particular sense that was present in Gnosticism somehow might be related to a similar dynamics that we're kind of experiencing. I mean, Roman Empire at that period was definitely undergoing several very intense transitions and movements, but from what I know, the Gnostic elements have been present in Christianity. Well, it differs, but from the relative beginnings, not from the very beginnings, but fairly early on, they started to develop these Gnostic elements. And the thing was that there was a certain period in time when I was really interested in the early Christian texts and how basically they eventually came to be integrated into a unified body of work that was deemed to be the Holy Script. So, you know, which texts were included, which were excluded, and it was a very interesting process, and there were very many texts afloat, and many of the Gospels that did get included, especially the three synoptic ones, so all the three ones except for the St. John, seem to have good historical backing in the sense of being very early texts, and there are so many important similarities that they seem to be kind of appropriate for this particular context. But you also had several other texts that seem to be quite early. One of them that is very interesting is Gospel of Saint Thomas. So that was one is a really interesting one, because it's structured somewhat differently. It's structured merely as the sayings of the Jesus, and some of them are quite similar to these that you find in the current Bible, but other ones are also quite different. And then you had a whole plethora of other, both Gospels and letters and what have you. And within this literature, you also had Gospels and letters that were somewhat different from the flavor that you get in the Bible. And these were then labeled as the Gnostics, because the emphasis was usually on the gnosis, on the knowing, on this idea that basically they are kind of two gods, the lower one and the bigger one, and then the whole plethora also of different entities. So from what I know, these movements developed relatively early on, after the say 50 to 100 years, 100 to 50 years after the death of Christ. And I would say it's difficult to pinpoint like a very specific set of socio-political changes that happened. I think that there are probably some claims and some analysis that would try to link the development of the Gnostic movement to certain societal happenings and occurrences, certain instabilities in the Roman Empire. But the specifics, I don't know. Just as a side note, when I was studying history, so one of the things that in my second year of those studies, I actually wanted to do my master's on the Gnostic movements, because that was actually the beginning where I kind of really got interested in this topic. But then eventually it was something that I left aside. And also one of the the professors that I consulted about this, he and I think this was a wise move. Back then I was a little bit kind of sore, but he said that this is not a good topic for an MA thesis. There's just too much ground to cover, and you really have to be a specialist to be able to do such a synthesis. So it's not something that the rookie would do well. So don't go there. But yeah, I don't know if maybe also Adnan or anybody else knows about any specifics with regards to the certain. I'm not aware of these, let's say, relationships specifically between the socio-cultural happenings or socio-political happenings and the texts and the movements themselves. For me, back then, the more interesting thing was basically the texts and how they basically emerged, what was going on. Things of that nature, and specific groups that developed. So yeah.
I mean, I don't know that much about the kind of social background to this, but one thing that I would just add here is that this topic. I mean, Gnosticism is a very, as I said, controversial term. It's not clear what it refers to. It was very fashionable to refer to heretical Christian sects as Gnostic, just because they're heretical. And it ties into a kind of any kind of a radically dualist understanding of Christianity. And there were also similar movements in Second Temple Judaism as well that weren't Christian. But in any case, it ties into the problematic of highly dualist readings of Christianity, and also the notion of there being some kind of an esoteric teaching of Christ. And this is just as a side note. It's interesting that one of the greatest opponents of esotericism in Christian history, St. Augustine, when he attacks the heretics, and this may have something to do with the fact that he himself was a Manichaean, prior to becoming a Trinitarian Christian. When he attacks them, he sort of goes really all out and saying that there's no way that Jesus had any kind of a secret teaching that was meant only for some disciples, etc. Even though the sort of hermeneutic that he ends up employing to defend his position is very similar to a kind of esotericist hermeneutic in a way, he just sort of rebrands it. He says it's not esotericism, it's just the fact that you need to have some kind of a process of education, some kind of a pedagogical hierarchy or something. And this has something to do with Gnosticism, of course, because Manichaeanism and all kinds of very extremely dualist movements, and also very dualist currents within Christianity, some of which were of a more esoterical bent, are all related. So it's extremely complicated in the early centuries of the church. So yeah, especially because prior to there being such a thing as a Nicene Creed, it was a mishmash of different texts, and it wasn't really orthodoxy is something that we can talk about now. It's not like second century people could talk about orthodoxy and heresy, obviously.
Well, do you have a follow-up on this? Was there like a spin to the question?
It was purely curiosity. I was wondering what the background is from which this seemingly early form of nihilism arose, especially in from what I know, a context that was religious in quite a different way. This seems to set itself apart quite strongly from the mainstream religion of the time.
Yeah, but the thing is, here's the thing. It might not necessarily be the case in these strong terms, because these movements they emerged like it was a set of different groups, and some of them they were connected, some of them they weren't connected. They were quite different. The influences on these groups were also very varied, from certain Jewish more radical, let's say, also Gnostic movements that were present then, and certain Neoplatonic influences. So it was it was a bit of a mishmash. And as Adnan pointed out, it wasn't always very clear where a certain someone would stand. It has to be taken into account that some of these texts were circling around, and it wasn't like you had a list of which are okay and which weren't okay. Now, eventually, this is also true, eventually these things started to segregate and separate. So there was, there started forming certain movements and certain trends and currents, but it wasn't like maybe the impression also of this radical separation, in a certain sense, might have been a bit of a construct of a later day, when you kind of have already this distinction, and then you present a certain something as being so very separate. but this is also an exaggeration, because you're quite right. Some of the groups definitely did consider themselves in these particular terms.
Then if we can focus maybe on the brand of Gnosticism that Jonas here kind of zooms in on. What according to what would be the remedy of these Gnostics to the nihilism that they felt? From what I feel from the text, it's some kind of a knowing, right? Some kind of a mystical knowing that connects you with this otherness, and through which you can get what exactly are they looking for? Tranquility, understanding?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to take a jab at this, Seb?
No, just go.
Yeah, basically, the notion is that the world is evil. That should be clear enough. And the way to extricate oneself is to attain gnosis, so some kind of a completely supra-rational knowledge of the transcendent and the transmundane and of God. And one thing that should be kept in mind here, when hearing about something like this, maybe, someone would be reminded of Neoplatonism, because in Neoplatonism we also have the idea, need to connect with the one, to put it somewhat strangely, but yeah. But Plotinus, he wrote an interesting work against the Gnostics. The Neoplatonists were very much against the Gnostics, and the main point of contention here was that the Gnostics felt that the world was bad, whereas Neoplatonists, as well as all kind of how to put it, anyone who was brought up in the sort of Hellenistic Platonic worldview, could not accept the idea that the world was evil, precisely because in the Platonist view, it's not evil, it's not ultimate reality, but it cannot be evil. To say that the world is evil, that the sun, the stars, the spheres, everything is evil, is utter blasphemy for anyone of a Platonic bent. Like, of course, those things are not the one. Those things are not the ultimate reality, the ultimate soteric thing, but to say that they're evil is to sort of blaspheme, in a very strange way. And I think Jonas here quotes from the text against the Gnostics, where Plotinus says something to the effect of, these Gnostics, they think that, even even the lowliest man is above the sun and the celestial spheres and the spheres and all that. Like, that's their blasphemy in a sense. I have no idea if this answers your question.
But the gnosis in general, just to kind of put it briefly, would be the capacity to cultivate a mode of life and a correlative mode of knowing, which would divest you from basically any entanglements with the material and the worldly, so to speak. And it would be in this regard some sort of a direct perceptive / intuitive insight into the properly divine. So this in a certain sense, liberating the pneumatic part from both the physical and the psychological, so psychophysical, and this would be then the mode of knowing. And in this regard, it could be seen how it could be somewhat akin to the Neoplatonism. But of course, then the question is, how do you conceive of these either hindrances or the lower dimensions or realms that you have to work with and free yourself from, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly to add here that of course the concept of gnosis is used in other contexts, especially in mysticism, in various traditions. It is used, That I think confuses matters a bit, because when it's used in mystical traditions, it typically refers to a kind of direct knowing that is super rational in a way. So it can be used for things as diverse as, I don't know, like in Indian systems, and is in Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism, prajna is in a way, can be understood as a kind of gnosis, because it is, above jnana, above discursive knowledge. In Islam, yaqeen, often translated, tangibly translated as gnosis. So it's used all over the place. It can be a bit of a confusing term.
Okay, maybe if we shift to slightly different topics, my question would be, to what degree were you convinced with Jonasian thesis? Do you find the parallelism compelling, convincing? Yeah, I will ask the question like this, because if I continue, I will already direct it in a certain way, lead it into a certain direction. So I would like to leave the question open, and just see your views on this.
So,
Anyone except
yeah.
me and Adnan? And occasionally Atul.
I can chime in an opinion to just get it started, but
Chime in
with
opinion.
the ball rolling.
We appreciate
Yeah.
the ball rolling attempt.
Yeah. I thought he was being careful in it. He was making enough reservations to be like, okay, I'm not trying to say that the same. So it felt like he's like drawing one point of contact with acknowledging that they were both very different in their own ways. So because of that, I wasn't trying to see him as taking them as the same, that's not what he was trying to do there. He ended with this note of the nihilism of today is much more radical than their nihilism, and it felt a bit like he's saying we see the situation with much more sophisticated eyes than they did. I'm not sure if I read too much into it, but it felt a bit like the undertone was one of their nihilism was still a bit naive, while our nihilism is more developed and the challenge it faces is more strong or more pressing. I'm not sure if I read too much into it, because I also wasn't sure what to think of that undertone. Like, is he? Yeah, it left me feeling like I need to know more about Gnosticism to really get this judgment. Yeah, these were some initial impressions, but I'd like to hear the others too.
Yeah, the others.
I'm just gonna be a sponge today, and I feel that I'm kind of catching up with the text, and this kind of first reading is when I'm just kind of settling in and not really yet have
fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing I would maybe add, and then others can chime in. He wrote his PhD thesis about Gnosticism under the supervision of Heidegger, and so he basically tried to apply, in a certain sense, what Heidegger was doing in philosophy. He was a student then of his to his PhD thesis and to this particular topic. And I remember I read Jonas' biography a way back. It's an interesting read. You could give it a go. Autobiography. And he describes how he was nervous when Heidegger didn't respond for a while, and then at some point I think he saw him or met him in theater, and he just briefly kind of smiled and said him, it's good, and he was kind of really happy. But then in this particular text, he does a flip, right? He does a flip, and he's basically saying, you know, well, existentialism is also Gnosticism. And I did have the impression that this was a little bit of him trying to settle his own scores with Heidegger. So, you know, he said, I was using Heideggerian phenomenology or existentialism to understand Gnosticism, but then I realized, wow, I mean, this is really, it's incredible how useful this tool is to understand Gnosticism all of a sudden. But then, yeah, they kind of have the same root. They're both emanating from the same source. It's not like that the Heideggerian phenomenology is particularly useful in understanding this. It's basically a manifestation of the same phenomenon. And I think that it was a bit of a critique of his own, of Heidegger. So he was trying to, by saying that existentialism in Heideggerian vein is Gnostic, was an implicit criticism of Heideggerian phenomenology. He does not articulate it in this particular manner, but he does basically say it, if you think about it, because it is obvious that from his perspective, the overtly strong emphasis on the dualist split is problematic. And while in the traditional Gnosticism, at least, and you know, this is not actually that little, you do have gnosis, and you do have the capacity to cultivate it, and thereby actually transcend this particular issue. So there's a really strong soteriological dimension there, which in a certain sense makes the project, in my opinion, very different from what you see then later on. So you have this, and in Heidegger, you basically lack this particular component, but you're left with this particular dualism. And not only that, because the realities or the cosmos is not negative or vicious, it is negatively disposed towards you, but it's just, it doesn't care. The whole situation becomes even more problematic, more unsolvable in many ways. So I think that he's basically developing a very specific, a very nuanced, or maybe not that nuanced critique of Heidegger here. So it's basically his criticism of Heideggerian project. Of course, he's talking about existentialism in general, and I wonder whether this in itself is already a jab against Heidegger, because Heidegger adamantly and vehemently opposed to this particular designation. He did not want to be called an existentialist. So by calling him an existentialist, he's in a certain sense already kind of critiquing him somewhat. And he's showing that Heideggerian philosophy ends up in the blind alley, so to speak, and doesn't really solve the issue. So the text, the way I read it was more or less a critique of Heidegger.
What would you make of the footnote that he puts somewhere midway, saying that it's the early Heidegger that he's talking about here, and the later Heidegger he would not call an existentialist?
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation to make in this particular sense. I mean, it would be really more difficult to make this particular claim from later Heidegger. You know, I mean, you have the Heidegger talking about technology and saying only God can save us now, and at the end of the text, almost uttering some sort of a soteriological moment there. And this, I don't know, this could actually be a bit of a proper Gnostic movement, if you think about it. And later Heidegger, when he really starts talking about, now see, fourfold, it's fourfold, right? Четверие. And similar ideas, then it really becomes a very problematic way of probably drawing these parallels, although probably also a case could be made. So I think that Atul, I think you were right in what you said. The way he's doing it in this particular text, he's being cautious in how he's developing his case, and he's basically making a two-tiered case here, or he's developing this particular essay on two levels. It can be easily read as just, well, here I am making these parallels and connection between these two things. Oh, this is very interesting philosophically. But there's another level to it, which is basically, in my opinion, the main one, which is the critique of Heidegger. So this is just something that I wanted to kind of bring to the table and ask if you had this impression, what your views were on this. Do you think it's a fair critique, and so on and so forth? Is it a fair critique of existentialism in general, to be honest? Because he was, in a certain sense, selective in the authors that he chose. Why didn't he include Marcel, whom we mentioned also yesterday, together with Evan Thompson, who was the Christian existentialism? So, yeah, just these questions, whether any of this makes sense.
Yeah, just say that the criticism of Heidegger is something that runs through the whole text almost. It's not, it's not always that explicit, but one really gets the impression that that's a big part of what he's doing. Selection of authors, yeah, definitely. Like, he basically boils it down to Heidegger and Sartre, which is, like, that's one way of defining existentialism, I guess. But it's a bit of a straw man to equate existentialism with that. It maybe, okay, one could argue it would be a decent case that maybe Heidegger and Sartre embody something of existentialism that is particularly poignant and that is particularly present, even today and whatnot, in a way that I don't know, Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, doesn't. So that'll be one thing. And as to his view of Gnosticism, one issue I have, rather something that is part of a broader issue that I have with Jonas's approach to God and religion, which is something that I don't worry, I don't plan on explaining in any detail here, but I feel that you can really take what he says, and in that I feel that it would be possible to not make too much of a modification to it, and to apply it to almost any kind of religious worldview that has something more of a transcendence in it than does Jonas's own, which he develops in the final essay. Because Jonas has a very interesting notion of God, fascinating. Not something, something that I do tend to have issues with, but nevertheless fascinating, maybe precisely because of that, of a God that is kind of vulnerable, that is built up, that is dependent on our actions, on human ethical choices, which is a very, very unique conception of God. I think that much is fairly easy to grant. And I feel that, yeah, the way he treats Gnosticism here, like, you can just change it up a bit and you can apply it to many things. You can certainly apply it without too much modification to someone like Plotinus, who was vehemently against the Gnostics, of course, who was, had a completely different view of the world. But still, there is a kind of transcendence there that seems to be something that Jonas would also criticize. Not saying that he would apply the same thing to all of those movements, but yeah, just as my opinion here.
Yeah, just to add on this, I think that yes, this particular there are definitely a lot of merits to what he's saying, and I think that also someone, for example, who in one way or another finds, let's say, existentialism intriguing and the current if there is such a thing, even like, you know, both of these movements, the problem is both Gnosticism and existentialism, in a certain sense, like these authors didn't, for example, the existentialists didn't see themselves as belonging to the same school, and they were so diverse with regards to so many different things. But if we put this aside, there is a certain arc in them that this attempt to revitalize, to reintroduce the notion of existence and flesh it out and make something with it. So anybody who feels drawn to this can definitely learn from some of the points that Jonas is making. And one of the points that I really liked is, for example, the point where he criticizes the ignorance of nature, and putting it aside and just becoming, you know, this absolute other, and almost accepting, like implicitly somehow, the modernist conception that has developed with the emergence of the science. And it just becomes like this mute, out there, other, nothing particularly of interest. And this is definitely something that, in my opinion, anyone who kind of is taking the existentialist themes and topics seriously and wants to expand them beyond, say, the question of the moods and your own ways of being anchored in a certain something, and how knowledge is grounded in other dimensions and so forth. And if you really want to get back to reality, this is something that you will have to reintegrate. And one thing, interestingly enough, Merleau-Ponty is very often also included in this particular group. You know, when you have like these anthologies of existentialists, Merleau-Ponty would crop up, and he's a very good example of someone who is very much aware of the importance, of the significance of somehow reintroducing this notion of, you know, ontology in the Heideggerian sense, of ontology of existence, of the domain of you being a whole being somehow engaged with the world, and taking this into very interesting directions. Again, Merleau-Ponty himself can be fetishized, and he often is in specific circles. So, you know, I'm sometimes really, we talked about this very briefly, but sometimes I'm really dismayed at seeing, you know, how now lived experience and lived body and embodiment are being used. To me, it's just dreadful. But the thing was, he definitely found a very interesting angle to do this, and an angle that managed to very creatively bring together many potentially interesting interlocutors, phenomenologists, Lebensphilosophen, people like Whitehead. So all of these people, or Schelling, for example, who were kind of trying to articulate notions of nature that would be different. And, you know, that there is a certain, like an axle that was being developed almost, that could bring these interesting people together, interesting, and open up itself to different and interesting avenues of exploration. So the point here would be that there is a lot of merit in some of the things that Jonas is saying, and at the same time there already are thinkers, and Merleau-Ponty being one of them, within the so-called tradition, who have kind of been doing this. And the other example is Marcel Gabriel. Okay, not necessarily the best example with regards to nature, or at least I don't know the works that would be dealing with that, but the essays, for example, that I read, that where he tackles the question of technology and all of that stuff. So it's really, you know, it becomes significant, it becomes relevant. There are different flavors, different approaches, different ways. And yeah, Jonas is being overtly, I would say, you know, I appreciate his capacity to kind of elucidate and extract sometimes certain important characteristic or strands within a movement or a development. he has this capacity, this old school capacity that nowadays in modern academia just wouldn't fly, because, you know, yeah, but how are you going to characterize this? And there are all these exceptions. So yeah. But, you know, sometimes if you take this, you really open up an interesting avenue and a perspective. But here, I think that this is a bit of a problem, that he's kind of maybe being too selective, or not selective enough with regards to some of these things. And I understand why. He has a certain underlining agenda, so he's following a certain path. Yeah. So yeah, that would be my addition to this.
I don't know if I have anything more to add here, but on pain of it being maybe a bit of a too distant a leap, is anyone interested in a tidbit about Nietzsche? And
Yeah, for
unless,
sure. I just wanted to add something. I was scrolling, I posted this in one of the groups we have on Telegram. This thing that you said about God, and how I haven't yet read the last chapter, so I don't really know where he's taking this. But from what I know, like you said, God is something that, like you said, it's fragile and needs to be developed and constructed. Well, what I found really interesting was a recent post by Joshua Bach. You probably know Bach, right? He's this fellow. He's from the. I think he's also broadly from the cognitive science background, and he's one of these. He is well respected among the accelerationist crowd. So he is one of the people who wants to kind of push the development of artificial intelligence forward and kind of make this particular leap. And he's an interesting character. I came across him a couple of years ago, I think 2 years ago or something, when I was still listening to Lex Friedman's podcast, and he had two appearances there, and both were just mind-boggling. You can listen to these interviews, like his mind is going all over places, and some of the ideas are just crazy, but there's also a lot of interesting stuff there. But anyway, he wrote this post, which I found interesting. I suspect that we can, and crazy in my opinion, like it's not heading in the right direction. I suspect that we can reconstruct the concept of God as an entirely rational concept, as a global optimum of transcendent, emergent collective agency, affording a space of justifiable vantage points that allow judging between the available event trajectories. So this seemed like a Jonasian God on coke and something else. It just seemed, you know, this is his wacky side. But I found it interesting, this idea also that I see floating in these accelerationist and techno-optimist groups, of somehow, you know, this movement towards the singularity, if it were happening, it almost always have like these religious connotations. Almost, it's like it has a very, very God constructing or God emerging element to it. It's just you know, a salvific something that is about to happen. And yeah, it's just interesting to see how many of these people who, you know, are blatant atheists and have been developed in this particular culture, then find through this fascination of technology some way of making sense of deity, and then striving towards this. You know, we have to attain singularity. This will be, in a certain sense, what religions were metaphorically talking about. Now we can do it materially, properly. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw this additional complexification.
I think I really agree with your sentiment there. And I remember recently listening to a podcast with Joshua Bach and Ben Goertzel. And there I was surprised that Bach was fairly very in the kind of everything is information camp, and consciousness is just a way of processing information. And Ben, surprisingly, I mean, because I didn't know that I knew hardly anything about him regarding his philosophical views, at least. He was really not in that camp at all. So it's interesting for Bach to have that kind of view of God.
Adnan, you want to hear another interesting spin? Something I learned like a couple of months ago. Ben was actually quite strongly influenced in his younger days by Maturana and Varela. Yeah, I mean, these are just like these weird connections that you come across. Yeah, so Ben was really he was digging the whole second cybernetics movement thing. So an interesting character. Actually, I should probably post that podcast. I think I know which one you're referring to in the group. I think
With
it's an interesting
Marvel
one.
theories of everything.
Yes, theories of everything. Yeah.
I had no idea about that with Maturana and Varela about Ben, but I mean, I don't know how surprised I am, even though I first heard of him through crypto.
Yeah, I
through
know. The same.
just-
That, and then I realized that he was like a really big name in all this artificial intelligence and all of that stuff, and saw some of his, and I had no idea absolutely what he stands for anything, and I wasn't even that interested. And then in some text, I found this being mentioned, and then I Googled it, and I found some of Ben's text when he was actually referring to that and saying how he was impacted by this idea, of operational closure, of the self-organizational systems and all of that. So yeah, I found it quite interesting.
Interesting. If I can just add a comment to this discussion, Adnan, when you hinted at what Jonas goes into in the last chapter on God, and this Jonasian vision on God as being vulnerable and shaped by human choices. I find it an interesting spin you give to it, Sebastian, with like the techno deity, the ultimate version that this gives rise to. But what I heard when you said that, Adnan, was I kind of heard in it the Merleau-Ponty's notion of the flesh of the world, and the idea, at least to me, flesh of the world feels like quite a religiously loaded idea, and it feels like a reconception of God. Maybe that's how I read it. An idea of not God the Father, but God the flesh, you could say. So an idea of God as shaped by, basically embodied, incarnate in the flesh, and enacted by living beings. This is something to go into when we get to that chapter, but I just wanted to drop these thoughts already.
Atul, one of the texts that I really hope that at some point we will be doing, but it will be, I mean, even with Jonas, we're kind of losing people by the boatloads. With this particular text, I can't even imagine that there would be more than 2 or 3 people after 3 or 4 sessions. That's the Process and Reality by Whitehead. Mm-hmm. And Whitehead's conception of God, I mean, that's an interesting debate as well, and the overall understanding of cosmology and nature and what have you, and bringing this to the table when one works with late Merleau-Ponty. Now this is hardcore stuff. I think that Jonas could be an interesting interlocutor here as well. I don't know, I might be wrong with regards to this. And then when you were saying this notion of flesh, it's a pity. I mean, the thing is, the flesh is at this point, I would say, more of a question than an articulation. Unfortunately, Merleau-Ponty died. We cannot know. That there are very interesting segments that we have, but you know how it is. I mean, we literally have like fragments. We don't even know if he would say that these fragments that we have, yeah, that's okay, I agree with what I wrote here. He might be basically reworking some of the, when you have these texts about these chunks where he talks about the flesh is the element in the ancient. What if he said, oh, well, yeah, I'm not really satisfied with this, I would probably rework this, but this is how you usually nowadays in the text, what is flesh, and then you put this as a quote. Well, Yeah, maybe. So what I'm trying to say is this is something that actually needs to be fleshed out, the flesh itself. And I think it could be taken into different directions. And the one of the also interesting and potentially interesting direction could be, you know, connecting something like the flesh or some of the other concepts that he was developing with this idea of Gottheit, in Meister Eckhart, where you have this a Gottheit which is kind of underpinning but at the same time permeating the Trinity. Yeah, and it is basically that the Godheit is the dynamics of the Trinity unfolding itself, so to speak. Yeah, this is, I was reminded of this when you said not God the Father but God the flesh. In this particular sense, when he's kind of saying that, you know, the ongoing birth of the Son that is happening in and through you is basically the Godheit. I don't know, how is it translated again? Godhead or I forgot.
Godhead, yeah.
Godhead, yeah. So I don't know, you know, there are so many interesting avenues to explore here, and this particular understanding of God in Whitehead, in also partly Jonas, and then in certain mystics, and taking this to the open question that we were left with by late Merleau-Ponty. I think that Atul, your intuition here is spot on. I think that, you know, the notion of the flesh, it has a very Christian underpinnings as well and connotations. That there is that element definitely there, you know, to this particular story. Now, I don't know how Merleau-Ponty would have developed this. We can't really know. But the fragments themselves can be telling and can be useful, and definitely there's a lot of material to work with already as it stands, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
By the way, if this process and what is it? Process and reality reading session ever comes, count me in as one of the 2-3 people that will be present.
We're going to remember that. We're going to take that seriously. So
we're going to take that seriously.
Try
We'll be
and
knocking
get out
at
of
your
it.
door, Atul. You promised. You promised. I don't care if you have a family now and other obligations. There is truth to be pursued.
Definitely.
But basically, Sebastian, I mean, that's precisely what I'm working on in a way.
Yes, precisely.
Because, you know, it's of course, Eckhart does play a, you know, a pretty sizable role there. But precisely that, how to understand the flesh, not as, because maybe the Jonasian way would be to say that the flesh is God. The flesh of the world is God. That would be Jonasian in a sense, because it seems to deny transcendence to some extent to God. Whereas what I would be interested in, and what would be an approach that is more in line with Eckhart, would be not that God is the flesh of the world, but that God can be, in a way, not that God is just the flesh of the world, but that God is known through that, or that rather that is one aspect of God, maybe to put it that way. Because, you know, if you say that God is the flesh of the world, you seem to be reducing God to that.
If I can respond to that, Merleau-Ponty does say that the flesh is transcendence. So he doesn't, the flesh isn't a sort of immanence, but it is already transcendence. It's already an openness to what is beyond its own flesh, basically.
In this regard, I also find this very similar to Whiteheadian notion, which is not pantheistic but panentheistic, where you have this idea of, you know, the cosmos not being the God but being in the God. So I think that this is something that could be brought together somehow nicely. I also have this impression that you know, Adnan, I understand your sentiment, but on the other hand, if you are not being careful enough, you end up with a certain something which, you know, if you say that the flesh is the aspect of the God, yeah, I'm not sure that this kind of fits nicely with the notion of the flesh itself, at least the way Merleau-Ponty wanted to function. Yeah, because
No, go ahead.
yeah, go on.
I mean, I'm not. I'm very unhappy with that expression, but the only thing that I was trying to say that it's always uncomfortable to say God is something.
Yeah, I understand.
That's the problem. Even if you say, even if the flesh is, of course, transcendent, because nevertheless, the way the flesh is transcendent cannot be exhaustively the way that God is transcendent. That's essentially the point, because God has to be transcendent in a different way, apart from the way that the flesh is transcendent, or the way that Dasein itself is constantly transcending. Like, sure, that's transcendence, but like, is that really the all you have of transcendence?
Yeah.
I never understood the flesh being kind of entirely transcendent. I always understood as something it weaves in and out with these chiasmic kind of junctions where it's not heterogeneously transcendent somehow. I never said this.
Yeah.
What do you mean by heterogeneously transcendent?
That it somehow it just weaves transcendence with immanence together, and I don't remember him saying this out loud, that it's that the flesh is transcendent all the way through. But to me that's always so. It just connects these and kind of like a Möbius strip, that it doesn't just have transcendence to it, but with these chiasmatic structure, it just gives the background texture to it. But I wanted to say that, but also kind of the other end, which is the same, the other side, which is the same side. To me, that was, I want to read it, this particular text. But to me, that just my understanding of the flesh kind of strikes me as, can it be transcend the flesh? Can the flesh be fully transcendent? Or I don't know if
I understand what you mean. I don't think that anybody here would like. Maybe Adnan is maybe even mostly gravitating, or most strongly gravitating in the direction of something akin to that. I personally do not necessarily have. You're talking about like how did you put it, like a absolute, not absolute transcendence, that's not what you use, but
homogeneous. So it's not I surprised myself as well, but it's not homogeneously transcendent somehow.
Yeah, I understand, and I don't think Atul necessarily wanted to say that. It was basically, the dynamism of the flesh has this openness that can then, the problem I have with, I think that people, when they think about the flesh, and this is maybe one of the negative sides, or maybe the drawbacks of playing too much with this particular notion, is that they start thinking about it as a bit of some sort of I'm going to use a strong word, like a blob that then just kind of folds and unfolds and interweaves and whatnot. And the problem is that it's not really intended as that. It's something that has, dimensionalities, and it can constitute itself in a way that is unexpected and is completely kind of open in this regard. It has dimensions to it, has layers to it. It branches out in a way where it constantly also self-transcends in a certain sense with the movement within which it is. So I think it's a useful concept to play around with. So I don't know, it can be approached from different perspectives. I think one interesting approach would definitely be to bring it close to maybe some of the theological discussions on the notion of the flesh, just in Christian theology, and what's been done with that, and finding these, like the movements of the flesh, or the relationship between because in a certain sense, like if you think about, and of course, you know, the Western mind, if it's not embedded already in the Christian tradition, has a visceral reaction and doesn't really see this as an interesting avenue to explore. But the image of the Christ, right? You literally have the God incarnate, which means you have the immanence and transcendence there. This is the interesting stuff in incarnation, in the idea of incarnation of God becoming flesh. And what the heck does it mean? Yeah, like truly, what the heck does it mean? I find, you know, I take this Christian question seriously. It's like contemporary, many contemporary thinkers are just like, yeah, whatever, this is not interesting, something passé. But no, it's actually extremely interesting. And the bringing these discourses together, and what it, you know, how I don't know how to see whether they can somehow, as Adnan started the presentation, mutually illuminate each other and maybe allow us to articulate certain aspect somehow. This could be of value, I think, at some point. Because yeah, I find it so intriguing that Merleau-Ponty, I mean, I get it, he was, you know, embodiment and corporeality and everything, and then the flesh. But flesh, yeah, you have it also in a specific tradition. And yeah, it is definitely laden with both connotations and dimensions and verticality. It has a lot of verticality in it.
What's the original French word that Merleau-Ponty uses?
Chair.
Chair, okay.
One thing there, Sebastian, firstly, what you mentioned about the incarnation being something that's not trivial, that really reminds me of you know, like when Kierkegaard talks about well, Christianity in general, you know, the sort of fundamental thing that he starts with and that he keeps coming back to is this irreducible paradox of the historical and the eternal coinciding. And that's another thing that's, you know, like you don't really find a lot of people talking about it in contemporary academia. And it's a fascinating question, you know, like for Kierkegaard, that was the whole paradox of not paradox as a kind of as a bad word, as a kind of, you know, something that you need to avoid. No, not at all. But the whole paradox of Christianity, that, you know, you have the eternal that is in a way enters into the historical through a particular historical event. So you have a particular event that manifests what is the absolute opposite of particular. That's like, I see that as the whole sort of motif of Kierkegaard's thought. And there are very few people, unfortunately, that are talking about things like that. And one more thing I just wanted to say about the Flash. I would not at all say that the Flash is utterly transcendent. You know, I was just talking about maybe God as something that is transcendent in a way, something, the word thing being inappropriate here, as God is being transcendent in a way that has to be different from the way that the Flash is transcendent. But that's not to say that the Flash is exclusively transcendent, because if it were exclusively transcendent, then why on earth would we use the word flesh?
But
you know,
what I really like what Bolin said, and he introduced this motif that is actually quite often in Varela, the Möbius strip.
Möbius strip.
So the interesting idea would be, you know, Möbius strip of Godheit flesh, where you really kind of, you know, you start with one, you get to the other, you get from one to the other, and I mean, this is just an image now, but the idea of what you said with regards to Kierkegaard would be, in a certain sense, this, like you have something that is the most concrete and historical eruption of a certain something that is the least concrete, but like they literally interweave in this ongoing dynamic. So you know, that would be an interesting, like a sheath or something. Yeah.
I personally don't think that Kierkegaard would be convinced even. I mean, I don't think that
No,
he would
probably
even
not.
like to use the image of the Mobius strip, because even that's a
course not.
representation for him. You know, it's like like fear and trembling. You know, when he talks about Abraham and the kind of you can't rationalize it. That's the whole
I
point.
get it. Yeah, I get Kierkegaardian point. So I know that he wouldn't be happy about it. But I'm trying to use some of the things that the themes that he brought to the table and kind of discuss with them.
Yeah, may I just say that as a kind of comment, that it took us like 9 essays, but like here we are getting to it, the Mobius strip of of the flesh of Godhead. Like
the
we
Godhead
are
flash
getting to
Mobius
it.
strip. Atul, you wanted to say something as well, I see.
I think we need to publish a paper on this exact. Yeah, comment on Adnan's.
A book. This is a book.
Yeah, this
This is what happens if you let
typical
someone
academic paper.
arrive late to the party.
Yeah.
But like this is where it's only starting to really get heated.
So this.
How am I going? Just sorry. I just a very brief thing. How am I going to tweet this? I usually tweet this and then I add hashtags. I'm going to do what? Mobius strip Gotthard flash.
What if it turns out that there are thousands of posts under
Yeah. We'll find a little group of people who've been developing this type of understanding of Gotthard.
Exactly. Start our own religion. This is the day of inauguration.
Yeah, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so this notion that the flesh is this immanent transcendence, and then really if we move to the level of God, it has to be in a way more transcendent than the flesh is transcendent. My thoughts there are that for us as thinkers, as situated thinkers, if we want to contemplate the divine, to contemplate God, we cannot feign ourselves into thinking that we can grasp this transcendence beyond our situated viewpoint. So to posit a transcendence beyond the flesh would be to act as if we are pure thinkers without any inherence, and only then can we grasp this objective transcendence. So the only way in which we can authentically think God would be from our situated intertwining with its transcendence, and then that would be the most authentic conception we can develop of God. These are some, like, from studying Merleau-Ponty, these are the thoughts that I get, like the objective transcendence is something that's only on the horizon, and it's a horizontal transcendence of God that we are in contact with.
Here I would say that I understand the point, and I think I'm in agreement with it mostly, because the point I was making is not that this kind of objective I wouldn't even call it objective transcendence, but this kind of more radical transcendence. The point I was making is not that it's something that we can grasp intellectually, but precisely that we cannot do that. Because, with transcendence of the flesh, we seem to be somehow chiasmically interwoven into it. And the point is, if God is more transcendent than that, or transcendent in a different manner, then it's not saying that we can grasp that other mode of transcendence, but precisely that we cannot do that because it is so radically other, more so the flesh, that there's no, it's a more kind of an apophatic move.
But Adnan, if you think about it, given the fact that the dynamics, for example, of the visible and the invisible and the figure in the ground is basically something that is, according to Merleau-Ponty, like this precisely fundamental dynamics. This also holds true, say, for mentation. So even every thought is embedded against the background of the unthinkable. So there you have, by necessity, this particular element of transcendence, which not only is there, but in a certain sense necessitates the capacity of articulation of any thought. So by, you know, like there's much more than we usually see in this simple idea of omnis determinatio est negatio. And I think it could be probably paraphrased in a way that could be even stronger with regards to this. So this particular dynamics, you know, I think that the nihility, the positive nihility, the positive absence is always in a certain sense present in the actual presence, so to speak.
I can't really articulate this at all, but Guénon has a very interesting parallel point to this, which is phrased in completely different terminology. He talks about metaphysical zero, which is literally the term he uses, which is, you know,
Physical zero.
far out. I think it's in the symbolism of the cross, which is definitely Guénon's one of two of his most, you know, kind of far out, most difficult books. But I think that's precisely one potential point of contact, because, you know, as you know, the whole thing that I'm fascinated by is that, you know, what is the point of contact? There is a point of contact, a point that is not a point, between this kind of Merleau-Pontian approach and the Guénonian approach, which seem to be at, you know, completely incommensurable, absolutely diametrically opposed worlds apart. There is a point of contact, and I think that's one way of phrasing it in a way, especially, you know, the point. Another argument that Guénon makes is that, you know, the point is in a way the primary element of space. The point is something that the point contains all space. The point precedes space, and in that way of understanding the point, it could be understood as the point of contact, not as a particular discursively describable point, but as the primordial point that precedes the notion of space.
Well, there's a lot of stuff that kind of emerges here. I think that this is just, yeah. Bolin, do you have any additional metaphors that you would like to throw to the table?
No, I think I was more kind of still thinking about what you said about the visible and the invisible, that this basic dynamics, and I don't know where Husserl talks about it, but as far as I remember, he once laments on how God perceives the world, and he cannot fathom that God wouldn't perceive the world, this pure transcendence, not as objects, so that God also perceives objects, even though he doesn't have a horizon, or the God doesn't have horizons of objects, and doesn't have this, now it's my wording, but doesn't have this visible invisible dynamics going on. And I don't know where it leads, this comment, but
isn't it true that his precise point is that, you know, this, for example, the structure of objectivity through Abschattung and all of that this is precisely something that even a god by necessity would have to undergo. So,
but he wasn't. So I think he's not as sure as, but so
he's not sure.
It's problematic for him. But to me, that, and I can't remember how I got to this thought now in this discussion, but to me, that's so that for Husserl, it is a problem whether how God perceive, or whether God perceived the world as well in objects, and I think it's quite paradoxical in some ways.
I also think, yeah, and I think that the God that he introduces here is basically like this player God, the philosopher God of say the last couple of centuries, not necessarily the one that we are trying to articulate here with the Möbius Gottheit flesh strip.
All right, yeah, well, that's fair enough.
Fair enough. We might say this is just like a very, very concrete, low level, low key instantiation of the Möbius Gottheit flesh strip.
Yeah, well,
Adnan,
distinction between God in personal mode and God in impersonal mode. You know, that's one way of putting it. Because God as personal God, as Ishvara, as, you know, kind of something that can be described as being, as existing, yeah, would have to perceive through the same those kinds of fundamental structures. But if we're talking about God as through the impersonal mode, as in a sense God of whom we cannot even predicate existence, because he transcends that, then it becomes very hard to suppose that God qua impersonal would have those structures of objectivity. Just throwing that out there. I mean, I've been throwing stuff out there for a while now, and
Yeah, I mean, but okay, I'm not going to pursue this because I would like to hear what Atul wanted to say about this. I just wanted to say that once you get to this particular level, I think that debate with regards to whether this type of Godhead would truly perceive the object is this doesn't stop making sense. I mean, it really, because this presupposes, I mean, if you really go down that route of a radical via negativa, talking about this particular Godhead perceiving, that's way too much attributing already in the question and in the positing. So it doesn't and ultimately what mustn't be forgot is it's even wrong to say that it's impersonal. Even that is like it's not okay.
yeah, of course. I mean, it's wrong to say that it's that kind. I mean, impersonal is only understood here as a kind of negation of personal. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not any kind of a positive designation at all.
But I would like to negate your negation of personal, because you're using the negation of personal with regards to a certain concept, and for it to make sense, you have to understand that. So in your negation, the concept is still present. Atul, save us from this.
Adnan, with this idea of radical transcendence, would it be fair to say that you are trying to practice a sort of gnostic insight into the otherness?
This is where the whole concept of gnosis kind of becomes extremely problematic, because again, what do we mean by gnosis? If we mean some kind of a knowledge that is distinct from typical mundane knowledge, so some kind of knowledge where the subject-object duality is in some way or other transcended, is not present in the same way. Not necessarily that it is something that kind of comes after, but maybe something that comes before the subject-object duality, whatever, something that isn't structured in exactly the same way. If we understand gnosis like that, then yeah, sure, that's gnosis. But then like Eckhart is doing gnosis. Every kind of mystic ever is doing. Dogen is doing gnosis. It then becomes, yeah, it is gnosis. But if we understand it in that way, it's just so broad that we have to. I mean, we can use the term. I mean, I've used the term on many occasions in such a broad fashion, but of course, then we have to keep in mind that we have to strictly completely forget the whole context of Gnosticism that we've been talking about here. It's not the same thing at all.
Okay, Letitia and Pia, would you like to chime in to this whirling, vertiginous articulation of the foundations of the ultimate reality, which is there, but it's also here.
Yeah, all you have to do is one up the Mobius strip Godhead flesh thing. Like you just have to go beyond that. It's very simple. Very simple.
Yeah, Le, come on.
Very simple task.
Yeah.
I will do that next meeting. In the next
you
chapter.
already have to do it now, just so that you prepare us for the movement.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, well, any thoughts about anything whatsoever, this or something that we said before that? So if you would like to throw something out.
Wow, there's a lot. It's difficult to choose one single thing. One thing that I was trying to do while I was reading the chapter, okay, there is this critic on Heidegger,
Yeah.
But I was trying to also understand the positive ideas of Jonas. So what he thinks about objectivity and the possibility of knowing something. And I found this chapter, it made me understand certain things that we discussed before. For example, in the chapter about the site that Atu presented, about objectivity and the possibility of knowing something, because I had this impression that Jonas was saying that we can know objects, even through these mediated form, but we can know things.
Yeah.
So I found this chapter helpful also in this positive way, not only.
Well, now you have to articulate it. So how was it?
Now it's too late.
No. I think we can do a couple of more minutes.
Well, especially when he is talking about the present, because he was criticizing this idea that in existentialism and Gnosticism, we don't have a present. And I understood that he was affirming the present. And I had this impression that the site that we discussed has this paradoxical form, the present, and also the access to something that was eternal, because it's fixed objects. And so I have the impression that he was, in a certain sense, explaining certain things that there were there in this chapter. So this intertwining between present and eternal. And
this is interesting. I mean, in relation to what we were now saying, this would basically mean that the Jonasian, the positive side, so the absence that is present throughout this text, would be the articulation of the vision as that entry point into the rhythm of the flesh, where you have this juxtaposition of the particular and the general, of the present and the absent.
That's it.
Of the immanent and the transcendent.
Perfect.
He's basically rewriting the visible and the invisible then.
He's actually like the unspoken part of this chapter is literally Merleau-Ponty's visible and invisible. That's what he's doing. Like if you read it, so he has not only two layers that I said, so the layer about Gnosticism and Heideggerian, he has the deepest layer, the most esoteric layer, with only the initiates like Laetitia were able to penetrate. And that literally unlocked the door to the visible and the invisible. No, but this is actually very interesting.
Yeah, for some reason I had the chapter about the site all the time when I was reading this one.
Exactly. I felt a similar parallel, but I couldn't articulate it yet in my mind. So I think you did it pretty well.
Yeah, this is good. This is really good. And yeah, I saw that this is like this was an ongoing topic for you, and going to but what is object, what is the presence, what is the real?
Keep repeating that until the end of the book, I guess.
Yeah.
But that's good. Every time it's becoming clear. And I had the impression that Jonas was saying that too, that we can progress somehow in knowing things.
And have we that maybe towards the end of our meetings we could maybe try to articulate, if we then manage to kind of get to a point where we understand how he understands these notions, the ones that were cropping up, that the ones that you were asking about. It's a pity that we didn't really do this more systematically throughout. So for example, the question of truth and how it pertains to what is present, what is given, to the question of the object. I mean, these would be very interesting topics, and we kind of let it slide. So it's good that at least Lei is kind of trying to keep track of these things. And
I'm trying.
But what is the object? Don't care about. There's just the Mobius strip of the flesh and the God.
Because somehow he's repeating that in different modes every chapter. So that's good too.
It's true. And here basically, precisely because this was an ongoing theme for you. You actually were able to see this absence. This is good. This is good. But I actually, I was kind of semi-joking only prior to that, because if you think about it, the Merleau-Ponty's entryway into the flesh, so to speak, is via perception. So in Jonas, what you pointed out is like this eruption in the present that kind of anchors you into something in a way that also propels you beyond, is precisely this dynamism that might be lacking in this regard. So, I was semi-joking when I was saying that Jonas kind of opened up a secret doorway.
This discussion reminds me of a part towards the end of the chapter where he also briefly hints at his own positive view, and he then draws back the idea of basically he's saying that this passive material physical universe is what gives rise, or which throws the living sentient being, and so he there connects it back to the idea of metabolism also. So there's like briefly a lot of threads coming together in like a short section. Yeah, it's hard to tease apart what exactly he sees there, but these themes all connect. How he connects vision to the present and the eternal, how he connects the passivity of metabolism to the activity of life.
He did the teleology too.
By the way, incidentally, given the fact that this was like a very prominent topic, Jan Halak, who unfortunately had to stop attending because of the lectures, he made a very strong case that the next book should be The Visible and the Invisible in the reading group. So our Simondon apparently will never come to fruition. He's just he's the horizon guy. He's our horizon guy, constantly on the horizon. He's been on horizon for 2 books at least. And apparently, it's in the definition of horizon that you can never reach the horizon. So
I mean, the visible and the invisible has also been on the horizon since we did the phenomenology of perception.
No, but we intentionally said that we kind of said, yeah, we're going to do it, but we want to do now something else. So we kind of moved away slightly from Merleau-Ponty for a time, for some more. But I think the time is ripe now. More so, I think it would be it would make more sense than Simondon. I mean, it's an interesting text, Simondon and everything, but given the overall dynamics of the groups, of our discussions, of the historical arc that's been unfolding, I think that it makes sense as a continuation to this.
I don't think anyone needs any convincing here, Sebastian.
I think that Pia does. I was saying this specifically to Pia. I saw her skeptical face. She was like, "No, I want to do Simondon. I want to do Simondon. I want to stay in the background silent and listen to Simondon. I'm not going to listen to Visible and Invisible." Is that right, Pia?
I need some time to unmute myself. That is somewhat right. I was looking forward to that, but
to Simondon?
But I think I'm happy with either.
Okay.
And given that I don't talk, I don't think there's much of a difference. So, yeah.
But it depends. Maybe if we were doing Simondon, you'd be kind of constantly grinning, which would be a really nice horizon background material, the tacit material.
Okay, I'll try to do that.
For Visible and Invisible?
Sure.
Cool. I think you will like Visible and Invisible, though. It's a crazy book in many ways. Yeah.
Almost as crazy as our discussion today.
Oh yeah. I think
Adnan, did you still want to add some note on Nietzsche? I remember at some point you.
I won't spend a lot of. I mean, I will just take maybe the final minute or two of this, if that's okay with everyone.
This is a final minute or two, so yeah, you can take this now.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah. So I don't know if anyone here has heard of Ernst Ortlepp.
I heard of him. I don't know.
No.
Yeah, because of precisely in connection with Nietzsche.
Yeah. So he was basically a poet that is mostly forgotten. An interesting. I mean, he's no Goethe and he's no Heine, but he has a kind of a like when you read him, he has a kind of Nietzschean thing about him. It's very hard to describe. Like one of his most famous works, which is he's extremely anti-religious. That's a big theme throughout his works, and he has a poem, Vater unser des 19. Jahrhunderts, the Lord's Prayer of the 19th century, which is a kind of I don't know, scathing critique of religion, which kind of is echoed by Nietzsche. That one in particular is very kind of Nietzschean, but that one was written in 1832, I think. So 12 years before Nietzsche was born. And so yeah, Ernst Ortlepp quite a bit older than Nietzsche. Nietzsche most like, I mean, he did know him. We know that much. And there's a paper from a lecture that I'll share by Helmut Walter from the University of Nuremberg. And it explores, this is the English version, this is also a German version, the original. And this explores the connection between the two figures, between Nietzsche and Ortlepp. So there's a lot of stuff from like various diary and kind of entries by Nietzsche, deciphering which ones, where he might be referring to Ortlepp, because there's not much by way of explicit references, but some people tend to view that as precisely maybe a sign that Ortlepp was extremely influential on Nietzsche. Sorry?
Absence again, presence in absence.
Exactly. So if anyone is interested in that, this is an interesting paper. Ortlepp himself, again, if you like, I do recommend just looking at least briefly at the Vaterunser, that poem, which is partly cited in this paper here, because there's something of a kind of Dionysian, chaotic mood about Ortlepp that really just instantly reminds you of Nietzsche. Yeah, maybe Ortlepp had a huge influence on Nietzsche. There's plenty of speculation of what their relationship might have been, but if anyone's interested in that, a very interesting thing for those that are interested in Nietzsche. And by the way, just one thing I'd like to share. Just last week, I don't know how at one of our courses Nietzsche got mentioned, and I asked the students how many of them started, for how many of them read Nietzsche as a kind of crucial step on their decision to study philosophy. It was a majority. So I was pleasantly surprised that Nietzsche is still the gateway drug for philosophy, because that's how it was for when I was an angsty teenager. It was, it has been that way for quite some time, and I'm glad that that's kind of still somehow continuing on. So if anyone is interested, that's a nice paper on that. And yeah, I don't know, I guess a nice way to sound smart to people who like Nietzsche.
I think that Ortlepp would be a marvelous also topic for a Hermetic episode. Like it would be a splendid one. I'm actually going to suggest this to James. Next time I talk. Huh?
I don't know. Maybe you mean his relationship to Nietzsche and this whole thing.
I mean, he's big on or keen on obscure figures in general, so that in and of itself makes him a very interesting candidate. But the fact that there is this potential relationship to Nietzsche makes it even more interesting in many ways.
I mean, the relationship in some ways is like, it's not potential. And this Helmut Walter, the historian that did that lecture, he's, as far as I know, still very much alive. I think.
Yeah, so we even have a potential interlocutor for our James.
Exactly.
Yeah. By the way, Balint, if you don't know Hermetics podcast, you have to check it out.
I don't, so I will.
Okay. Okay, any last thoughts and comments?
Can you write it in the chat, please?
Oh, right, yeah.
Thanks.
I've heard some rumors that there might be an episode on a thinker we're interested in.
Yeah, I heard so as well. Relatively soon, I also heard.
Definitely by by our next meeting.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. This was a wacky discussion. The next session I think will be after the new year already, right? I mean, already in the new year.
Yeah, I think the next one, it is because it's now 3 weeks, but it's 3 weeks from now would be the 28th of December, which no one is going to be online probably. So it will be on the 4th of January.